right, well, welcome everyone. This is PLMW at ICFP 2022. And I'm really happy to be here in beautiful Ljubljana. Thanks so much to our local hosts. All right, so who are we and who are you? So the main organizer, is Jose Calderon. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. University of Maryland, and also works at Galois as well. So Jose is the main organizer. He was chair last year. He's the senior chair this year. Unfortunately, he can't make it due to family reasons, other personal obligations. My name is Kristopher Micinski. I'm an assistant professor at Syracuse University in the US. And I am the junior chair this year. All right, so who are you? So it's a mix of students. I'm actually going to start by asking you to maybe raise your hands a little bit. So what if, I'd like everyone to raise their hands who's either a sort of a bachelor's student or a master's student who's considering doing research in programming languages. Great, great. That is kind of the main purpose of PLMW, is to find junior students and sort of serve as a place for them to be able to connect with the programming languages community. Find more senior people. I think we've all had the experience of reading a paper and finding it very hard to understand what's going on, or just ask ourselves what led somebody to sort of think about this idea, get embedded in this research area. And that's kind of the goal of PLMW. So we're really excited to have junior students. We hope that it's a good time for you. What about doctoral students, so people working on their PhD? Awesome, great, good mix. And what about anybody else? Anybody who's not in school or anything like that? Ah, great, great. The panelists. All right. All right, so maybe some icebreakers. Raise your hand if you think you might be a candidate for the longest trip here. Where are you for? Where are you from? Maybe Singapore. Awesome. I think it's whatever it means to you. Difficulty or, duration, something like that. I see. Wow. How was that? Is it the kind of thing where you just ride or do you have a sleeper car or? I see. Nice, great. Someone over here. Nice, I see. Yeah, subcells. Yeah. Of course. Great, very cool. Well, hopefully you make it back without too much trouble. Okay, so who has a favorite programming language or programming language they use them in sort of some subset of the time that they think might be most hated by the ICFP community? So raise your hand if you think you might be a candidate here. So I use C++ some of the time. And some of it is just because as much as I'd like to use Rust, some of the libraries just aren't available in Rust yet. Maybe hopefully that will change. I also write in a lot of Scheme, which based on my relative attendance of the Scheme and Haskell workshops doesn't seem to be as big as it used to be. So come to the Scheme workshop. All right, so some big questions worth asking. So sort of why are you here at PLMW specifically? Which of course you don't have to have an answer. If your answer is just you wanted to get a free trip to ICFP, that's of course very fine as well. But then also maybe why are you here at ICFP? And this is kind of something we'd like to have you sort of think about in terms of what you're hoping to get out of the conference. Because the purpose of PLMW, we've seen that over the years, ICFP, I think more than many other conferences, it can be very inaccessible to new students. I often hear the comment from students that say that, they went to ICFP for the first time and they didn't really get anything out of the talks just because the material is very technical, that kind of thing. And so, the hope of PLMW is that we can kind of give people a hook into the community so that even if the work is sort of very depthy and technical, they have some connections with people that they can use to kind of distill it down to kind of the concepts, kind of make sense to them. And also, what do you want out of your experiences here? And maybe that's just making friends, or maybe it's learning about a particular topic, or connecting with senior researchers in a specific area. All of those are great answers. I personally am here for the food, so of course that's also an acceptable answer. And so I think a lot of us kind of have this feeling that when we approach ICFP, and so this was kind of my feeling when I started, was that I learned about Pascal. It seemed very nice. Actually, for me, it was standard ML, but of course I learned Pascal just because I was on the internet around 10 years ago, and that was a big thing. And then, of course, I was very quickly confronted with these huge formalisms that felt like, of course, the thing on the left was very nice and made a lot of sense, and that was the thing that attracted me to functional programming. And I quickly ended up in this thing on the right. And the question I think a lot of us kind of hope to answer at PLMW is, how do we go from the thing on the left to the thing on the right in our own papers, reading other people's papers? And so I guess I would start by saying it's very common to understand sort of, at least with some of the talks, hopefully not all of them, but maybe all of them as well, to get almost nothing out of them the first time you come to ICFP. I would say if you feel that way after going to some of the talks, I think, don't be too afraid, since I think lots of former PLMW attendees who, now successfully publish papers better than mine also are in this category of this work. And that's, of course, the case for career researchers as well. So lots of people who even publish at, ICFP, I would, at least hypothesize that a good number of them couldn't pull out an arbitrary paper from some other area, necessarily be able to get everything. All right, so the purpose of PLMW is to kind of help distill this, but at the very least to make you feel that this is not an uncommon feeling. That if you're feeling this way, it's not an indication that you shouldn't be. So we're extremely happy to have a junior cohort that we hope to cultivate over the years. Hoping that this will be a good opportunity for you to meet with people and discuss kind of how you understand and intuit some of the concepts and be able to make sense of them, whatever that means to you. I think a lot of programming languages has this property. So actually I pulled this out from one of Tom's papers, which is sitting in the front row. He's going to be on the panel later. And I remember sort of reading that paper he had pointed me at, and I found it very hard to read. It was a paper on push-down precision for sort of static analysis of higher-order programming languages. And of course, I think a lot of work in this area has this kind of flavor where there's kind of an iceberg. And the very tip of the iceberg is what the paper is about. But it might be the case that the thing that really stops us from being able to make sense of the paper is just this huge mountain of kind of information that it's building upon. And so all these different related concepts, natural deduction, sort of structural abstraction, things like that. I guess it's here twice, so very important. Sort of underlie kind of the different things. And I think, identifying what's the novel contribution of a paper and being able to articulate that is the kind of thing that, if you can do that, the papers are kind of much easier to sort of contextualize. But it's very hard to get to that point. I think most of us feel that way. And so, it may just be the case that once you understand most of the background material, getting the message of the paper is, just as simple as changing maybe a line in the implementation. I think a lot of papers have this kind of flavor, this kind of message. And then the rest of the paper hangs off that to kind of give you the information of why is it relevant to do it this way. And so we, the chairs, like to think of PLMW as kind of an on-ramp. So I think more than most other fields, at least when I look at sort of the explosion in machine learning, and when I look at PhD students in our department who come into ML and publish a paper in the first 6 months or something like that, I do feel like PL and FP in particular, in some sense, can be very deeply technical. And so obviously this is kind of rewarding, it can be. but it can also be very daunting. So I think that requires us as a community to be able to cultivate healthy conversation with young researchers as to what what the nuts and bolts are that went into the design of the paper. And I would also say, technical work is not always deep. Of course, technical work can be very deep, but deep work is also not always technical as well. There's plenty of great ideas out there that are very simple. And I think, we often hear the comment about the programming languages community that, unfortunately, it can be sort of attractive to us to kind of dress up the papers with sort of technical formalisms just because we're afraid that very simple ideas won't be seen as good enough. That's not the case. And so I think, that's something to keep in mind. I don't really have a comment about how to fix that, whether that's actually true, but I think that's the way that I felt before. We want you to use PLMW as a way to facilitate your goals. So whatever those are, if your goal is to understand a specific research area in a better way, if your goal is to connect with potential faculty that you would like to work with, that's also great. Or if you're just here to sort of meet some new friends, learn about different kind of trends, just enjoy the local cuisine, that's all great. And so, I've talked with Jose a bunch about this, and we both agreed that sort of for first-time attendees, we really want them to think about PLMW as kind of an on-ramp into the programming language community. And so it can be very hard if you just sort of see all the kind of papers that come out, you read them, you try to get a sense of what's going on. It can be really hard to figure out, what are the current directions that people are really passionate about working on. And we see PLMW as a way to try to either get a sense of the community by some of the technical talks that people will give, but also to connect with people in sort of an informal way and just get an idea of sort of what kind of topics they're passionate about at the current time and why, what kind of the current directions. And hopefully it's lower risk than maybe the main ICFP. Of course, if I were at the main ICFP, I would probably even be scared to ask a question during a regular session. But you shouldn't feel that way at PLMW this before. So there's nothing sort of too naive. That's a big point that you'll like to say. And so hopefully, even though this is how it starts, we'll eventually move into something like this in terms of your map. So we see PLMW as map making. And we think about it this way in the sense that when you start out by thinking about a certain research community, of course you see kind of the main originating work in that field, and you see where it goes over time. And it can be really hard to get an idea of who works on what, and also maybe why. And so, when I was starting my PhD, there are of course lots of different topics that were in vogue at that time, things like using interactive theorem provers to sort of mechanize meta theory, that kind of thing. But it was very hard to know kind of who in the community was interested in what topics, and even people publishing papers on the same, something that looked very much the same, was not necessarily a good indication of that. And so we kind of see PLMW as also a way for you to be able to make your own mental map of what the community is working on. And so, I think it'll be useful for you, we hope, in the sense that you'll know kind of who to talk to if you have a particular question. Maybe, for example, you want to know something about abstract interpretation plus gradual types or something like that. Our hope is that you'll have some flavor of who's doing some work on that topic. Or at least, if you didn't know, who could you ask that might be able to connect you with someone that would be able to put you in contact with someone who might be able to help you out. And also just kind of knowing, whose work is relevant to kind of read. I think we all, even senior researchers, have the problem where even after you publish a paper, someone might point you at some very related work in maybe a slightly different field. So, for example, we work a lot in static analysis and sort of things of that nature, but there's surprisingly relevant work in things like databases community in terms of implementation for static analysis. And it can be very surprising to find out what work is going on, even for people who are relatively senior. I think we can often get kind of siloed in our research communities we can see kind of the technical problems that appear very challenging to us without seeing kind of the bigger picture. And it's also important for you to know this because beyond being just useful for you personally, it can be useful for the community. Since that maybe once you kind of are sort of more well connected to who's kind of doing what, you can also help form connections between new people. So after have the experience, we'll all kind of go out and meet with people after conferences and things like that. And they'll sort of tell me, oh, I'm working on this one topic that I've heard of new, and I can kind of think, oh, my friend is working on this similar topic. People want to talk to them more often. It's the other way around. And that's a great way to form connections. I mean, for faculty members, it's a great way to meet collaborators and students and people to work on grants with. But I think for students, it's a great way to find people to maybe go do internships with. Other people that you might, for example, have as an advisor or postdocs. There's always the next step. People to write recommendations, others that kind of thing. And I think another big problem is kind of understanding what are the big problems in the area right now. There's been so much good work in PL throughout the years. I think it can be the case that today there may have been some amazing work that got done in the 80s, but we just haven't worked on it recently because of whatever reason. Maybe there was some implementation technique for that mechanism. And it's kind of important, I think, to understand what are the kind of big problems in the area right now that people care about, and why. And of course, there are some problems that are so hard. For example, I think of the library problem, static analysis, that kind of thing. That even brilliant people kind of know not to work on because it might be years of their life. You've already done a PhD and not eager to do that. Even if you never intend to work on some topic, it's still sort of useful to know who might work on it as well, because, of course, it may be the case that there could be tangential applications. And so, I think in programming languages, we can see it as kind of a relatively old field compared to, for example, the extremely fast-moving case right now in the machine learning community and that kind of thing. And so, for example, two papers that we still see the influences of today, at least on the sort of for all side of things, is the abstract interpretation work. Of course, we still have, at least I would say, probably every ICFP since, this paper was published, I think, at the original compo, maybe one of the first and second ones. We still see papers on abstract interpretation probably at every one of the conferences since I would guess. And then, of course, symbolic execution from 76. Sort of existential side of things. That's the kind of thing that we see repeated resurgences of that. And at least if you're in my shoes, I was in the position where I actually found an old book by the Crusoes in my university library that was kind of typeset in this sort of old school typesetting format and things like that. And I tried to read the book, and it was way harder than anything in any of my university classes. And I was very kind of impressed by the fact that I couldn't even make it past the first 28 pages or so. I really did anything out of it. And I sort of asked myself, how am I going to get a PhD when I can barely understand this stuff? And this was published nearly 50 years ago. And I think, that's a challenging question that we have to ask ourselves, and we hope that PLMW will help you to feel less discouraged about it. But I would say, new ideas, or these old ideas, these ideas see kind of repeated resurgences over time as we make paradigm-enabling advances. For example, data log, just a restriction, Hornsat. And, of course, it was something that we had articulated very long ago, back in the turn of the century, 100 years ago or so at least. But since then, there have been repeated interest in it, because of first semi-naive evaluation, for example, binary decision diagrams next. Of course, we realize binary decision diagrams have ordering problems. And now, with things like parallel compilation strategies, that kind of thing. On the symbolic execution side, something that I did a bunch of work in during my PhD, after that King 76 paper, it really wasn't touched very much for the next 20 years or so. That's my impression. I kind of back to the literature. And my impression about why it got so good is just that, of course, Dawson Engler and that group have done a bunch of work kind of applying it, real binaries, real programs, back in sort of the most recent turn of the century, 2000, 2006, sort of that time. I guess before that, way before that. And so that was because of advances in SMT technology. And then, of course, there was compilation, symbolic execution, symbolic texting for doing things like using frameworks, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there was the abstract interpretation community, one of the oldest ideas in our sort of community. And, of course, we have collecting semantics, the original ideas, and now we've got work like the abstracting, abstract machine methodology, that kind of thing. We've seen a lot of resurgence in that area. And so you kind of feel like everything that's old is kind of new again in some sense. And it's interesting to me to kind of see, why did these old ideas continue to persist? And what makes them attractive for the current day, for the kind of new techniques? And these are very good ideas, but somehow we keep finding applications for them. That's something I think is very interesting about the thing. So I'd like to say and end a little bit with some misconceptions that I have. So I think one thing that you're very sort of eager to do as a PhD student is to think and assume the field kind of gets monotonically harder. In the sense that if I read a paper from whatever the 70s, of course, if I try to publish a paper at this ICFP, it has to be more technical, it has to be, whatever, better in some abstract way. And I think, lots of older work can be very deep, technical and meaningful. And of course, lots of new work can, be very attractive at first, but then kind of flop as we realize it wasn't useful for whatever reason. Right? That's kind of the state of how things go. So the research community is kind of chipping away at the state of the art. Some of our directions will be very useful, but some of them will not always pan out. This was a big one for me, thinking that everyone does research in type theory. The internet will tell you this. You can come on Reddit or whatever, Hacker News or something like that. It seems like everything is type theory these days. And of course, I love looking at type theory myself, but it's just not something that I had the opportunity to seriously pursue as a researcher during my PhD. And that was something that was kind of frustrating me for a while, but eventually I made peace with it and realized there's lots of exciting research to be had in these other areas. I think the other one that kind of confused me was just that there's lots of work that is very deep and technical and theoretical and genuinely very good work that might just not be passionate, might not be something you're passionate about. And that's completely okay. Lots of ICFP topics are things that I kind of find this rather boring. I just don't find them very exciting to me, even if I think that they're very, very good topics for people to study. It's just not an area that's really cool to me. It doesn't mean they're bad research. And of course, lots of other people in the community would also look at stuff that I work on and think that that's boring as well. That's both ways. And of course, the last one is, sort of technical work is sort of smart, right? So technical work can be very profound, but so can simple work. I think, in our community, there's kind of a place for both. So if you're somebody who really likes working on deep technical work, that's completely great. Of course, we need those people, just in the same way that we need people who are sort of generalists and kind of be able to distill some concepts and kind of form bridges. All right, so to sort of conclude, the whole point of PLMW is that we want you to succeed in whatever way that means to you. So ideally, PLMW is unnecessary because the community is just welcoming enough as it is. So hopefully we'll be able to get to that point and all students will easily be able to kind of find an onramp for themselves. But I think as an area, we have to kind of cultivate a cohort of junior students if we want the field to survive and thrive. And I think that's a real thing in a sense, because the field is so small, we really have to put in some work to be able to make sure that students have a place where they can actually get into the field. I think, if you look at, for example, again, sort of ML community, it's very easy to just go pull out some Python libraries and do some really cool state-of-the-art machine learning tasks. Where if you want to do state-of-the-art, interactive theorem proving, it's maybe possible. You may be able to go to some GitHub repos and open up some proofs and sort of do some stuff with it. But it's not really the same. And I think that requires us as a community, it's the onus on the senior members of the community to sort of help newcomers sort of orient themselves. And so PLMW is our way of saying that you should feel free to ask us questions, make us sort of introductions, and also bounce ideas off of. So we're so happy you're here, and I'll conclude with that, and I'll give the floor over to Sam, who's going to talk about how to be a successful PhD student. So thanks so much. I'll be around the rest of the day. Again, my name is Micinski.